So not only are a lot of hiring practices biased and based on cultural assumptions, false assumptions and notions, but colorism plays into that as well. Colorism is a factor that is often overlooked when we talk about racial disparities in hiring and in the workplace. If you didn't see last week's live, it was really good, so go back and check it out. I talked about colorism in the school to workforce pipeline. But if you're applying for jobs that require some type of formal education, you overcome the colorism in the school system, you overcome the colorism in that educational context, only to face colorism when you're in the job search phase of your career. The first two studies actually looked at white people who were making hiring decisions and white people who were doing interviews. And this is really important. So I recently shared two types of colorism. One was intra-racial colorism, which is when people of the same race discriminate against each other based on skin tone. There's also interracial colorism, which means that someone of a different race can also perpetuate colorism against us. And so this is what's happening a lot of times in the workplace. And because not enough people acknowledge interracial colorism, these problems and these issues go overlooked, right? So if you are one of the people who has the mindset that, oh, well, colorism is just Black people hating on other Black people, then you're gonna miss the fact that even your white hiring managers, even your white interview board members are also having biases against darker skinned people of all races, right? And so the first study said that for white people making hiring decisions, skin tone had a greater influence on their choices than the applicant's level of education and years of work experience. Okay, so let's just let that sit in the air for a second. That is shocking to some people who are newer in their journey of learning about colorism. I know some of my day ones, y'all, we've already been down that road, right? Y'all are not shocked by that. So again, when we think about the barriers in education itself, not only are lighter skinned people more likely to get the education they need, right? But then they're also more likely to be hired even if they don't have higher education. It's layered, very layered. And so when I talk about compounding privilege, that is what I'm talking about, compounding privilege. So if you're lighter skinned, not only is your journey through the school pipeline facilitated and bolstered and supported, but even if you don't do well in school, even if you don't attain higher education, even if you don't get that extra certification, even if you don't get that extra degree, you're still more likely to have success on the job market than darker skinned applicants who felt like they have had to go and get those extra certifications or get those extra degrees. And I'm kind of passionate about this because this is a lot to do with my story, and I know a lot of dark skinned people talk about this and feeling like, oh, well, no one's going to acknowledge me without certain credentials, right? Because I have to overcome not only sexism, but also racism, and not only racism, but also colorism, right? And all these other things. So that's one study. A second study also looked at white folks, and this is Lance Hannon. This researcher is called Lance Hannon. He coined the term white colorism, again, to debunk the myth that colorism is just, Asian to Asian or Black to Black or indigenous to indigenous, that white people are also engaging in the process of discrimination based on skin tone, even amongst people of the same race. And so in Lance Hannon's article, he also looked at white interviewers, and they were more likely to see light-skinned Latino and African-American applicants as more intelligent, right? So it's not a matter of, and this is again, regardless of test scores, regardless of other demographic factors, regardless of, again, education levels. So regardless of other data that is present, what his study showed was that white people who were interviewing, in this study, applicants, if they were African-American or Latinos with lighter skin tones, they were automatically perceived as more intelligent than darker-skinned African-American and Latinx applicants or interviewees. And so this is, I think, when you understand that white people also perpetuate colorism in the workplace, you understand why the scope is a lot bigger than people think it is. You understand why the impact of colorism in corporate culture, in jobs of all types, in workplaces, in business, right? That the scope of it is a lot broader than just being bullied or teased, the way a lot of conversations around colorism try to limit it to. And so this is why colorism is systemic. When we talk about colorism being a systemic issue, this has a lot to do with why. Is because regardless of the race of the person who's doing the discriminating, it can still happen. So it's not just a black cop, for example, who would discriminate against a black civilian, right, and assume that they are guilty. But even white cops are likely to assume darker skinned, Black and brown and BIPOC individuals as being more quote unquote criminal, right? I know I'm kind of going away from the hiring piece, but I just wanted to kind of reiterate that, because as I continue to do this work every day, it still astounds me how many people are still unaware. And so I have to do my part to make sure people are aware. And if y'all tell me like, okay, Dr. Webb, everyone in the world has said they understand, I'll stop. But for what I'm seeing, that's not the case. Okay, so the last study, this study wasn't on hiring or interviewing specifically. It was more so an overview of colorism in Latin America. And so a part of what their research talked about was not hiring in particular, but the stratification in terms of career paths and job status. So they just noted that in Latin American countries, so this is not Latinx people in the US, this is other countries in Central, South America, the Caribbean, et cetera. So other countries outside the US, that for Latin Americans with lighter skin tone, they have higher positions in business, higher positions in academia, so universities, college professors. They have higher positions in politics and government. And they have lighter skinned Latin Americans also have greater occupational prestige. So the higher status jobs, the jobs that people associate with higher socioeconomic class and that sort of thing, they are disproportionately filled with light-skinned or European Latinx individuals. And so on the same token, on the flip side, darker skinned people in that job market are often seen as having less prestigious jobs, less prestigious occupations, right? And so I'm trying to tread lightly here too, because in describing the hierarchy, I don't want to reinforce or condone the hierarchy, right? I'm not saying that some jobs are inherently superior to others, but in thinking about class dynamics in different countries, there are certain occupations that are attributed greater value and greater status in society, right? And those jobs are disproportionately filled with lighter skinned individuals, right? And I want to kind of extrapolate some key takeaways based on that and based on other things that I know and that I'm aware of. The first one is that you can't create racial equity in the workplace if you ignore colorism. I've been saying that since the dawn of my platform, but it bears repeating because, again, people still don't know. All those great efforts it's like running on a hamster wheel if you're not looking at colorism as part of the equation. Because the racial identity that we check on the census or the check boxes that we put on the job application form are only a part of the equity equation. So if you're in a meeting, if you're in a training, if you're in a casual conversation about diversity in hiring or equity in hiring, bring up colorism. Do not let that conversation or that training or that meeting end on racial equity in anything without putting colorism on the table, without making sure that colorism is embedded in the content. And then the second thing is ask yourself and your hiring colleagues the following questions. Or for example, questions such as, am I raising the bar for this darker skinned candidate in ways that I did not for the lighter skinned candidates? Okay. A second kind of question you might ask is, are we requesting additional proof of information to judge their competency or their fit for the job when we don't request the same additional information for other candidates who are lighter skinned? And so one example of this, a few people, mainly on Instagram, so shout out to my Instagram folks, a few people sent me this video clip of a dark-skinned sister, a dark-skinned Black woman. She was wearing like this bright pink color, it was really fly. And she was telling the story of how she had to do 10 interviews. She had to go through 10 interviews to get the same position as her light-skinned friend who was only required to do 3 interviews. Okay? And so if you're on that hiring team, if you're on that hiring committee, somebody at the table, somebody in the room needs to be asking, Why are we making candidate X do 10 interviews when we only made candidate Y do 3? Okay? And again, these candidates were the same race. They were the same race, but one was light skinned and one was dark skinned. Now, if you are not in a hiring position, I still want you to say, I am willing to question my current biases, right? That's an ongoing process, folks. We already know that, though. I'm preaching to the choir.